Works better when you turn it on. One of the many steps on the journey that led to ministry was time working for a surveyor. The time working for Dave taught me a great deal about property issues like easements and deed restrictions, courthouse research, and zoning and land development laws. Of all the lessons I learned, though, one really surprised me. I could not believe that in the world of points and lines and degrees and directions and minutes and seconds, what I experienced could happen. A property owner hired a contractor to build a retaining wall in the back of his property. The contractor hired our company to survey the property to make sure the wall would be on the property owner's property. Makes sense, right? So the property was a commercial property that fronted on a heavily traveled street. The rear of the property had a significant slope, hence the need for the retaining wall, and adjoined the rear of a residential property which fronted the next street over. We completed our survey and set the pins. A couple days later, we got a call from another surveyor who had surveyed the property in the rear, telling us that our pins were in the wrong place. So we went back out and double-checked everything, and we're pretty sure that our pins were in the right place. So then we met with the other surveyor and compared maps. To complete our survey, we used a reference point out in the front of the property we surveyed and worked our way back. To complete their surveyor, the other surveyor used a reference point in the front of their property and worked their way back. And we had 2 feet of disputed property in the rear of these 2 properties. As time went on, I learned that that's not all that uncommon. So it's sometimes not easy to answer the question, where's the line? So last week we looked at the first 8 verses of the 12th chapter of Romans. We said that Paul spent the first 11 chapters laying out his theology, and now he's turning his attention to the practical aspects of living as a follower of Jesus. In last week's reading, Paul was using a roller and painting the wall, my kind of stuff. Give me a roller, let me paint the wall. Now today he's giving his readers the fine stuff. He's painting the trim, the stuff that I try to avoid like a plague. He's doing the finer work and detailing the specific attitudes and actions that must grow out of the principles he's established in those first 8 verses. This letter may be addressed to the church in Rome, but Pastor Mary Hinkle Shore tells us that Paul is not necessarily addressing specific problems in Rome. She argues that these exhortations speak to any community patterning its life after the crucified and risen Christ. All of the verbal forms, she says, are plural. It's as if Paul is saying, don't try this alone. This advice is being given to a group of people, and much of it concerns their shared life together. Pastor Shore says the imperatives in these verses relate to 4 circles of relationships. The first is kinship within our own Christian community. We are to be people devoted to each other in mutual love and outdo each other in showing honor. We hold up each other in prayer, take meals to each other, support those who grieve, and celebrate life's milestones. We've certainly seen our share of all that this year. The second circle is introduced in verse 13, the saints and those needing hospitality. Paul is telling us that generosity is not limited to our immediate family and community. Paul wants us to go beyond our family and community and care for people in need regardless of how they fit into our religious, social, or political circles. So last month, Debbie and I had the opportunity to go to St. Timothy's Lutheran Church in Allentown for their worship on Wednesday service. This service was an interfaith service led by the Barn and Congregation Knesset Israel, and its purpose was to welcome Abbas Khalaf and his family to the community. the Khalasar, an Iraqi refugee family that the two congregations jointly sponsored for resettlement. Sponsoring refugee families for resettlement is an example of extending hospitality to strangers. I suspect over the coming weeks and months, we will learn ways that we can show hospitality to the people in Texas and Sierra Leone and wherever else disasters have struck. The third relationship circle is blessing directed towards one's enemies. Now, I don't know about you, but this whole Christianity thing sometimes I think would be a whole lot easier if we could take verses 14, 17, 19, and 20 out of the reading that June just read and put them aside. And while we're at it, let's take some of the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, and some verses in Proverbs and a few other places and shove them aside. Really, Paul? You want me to bless those who persecute me? I can't repay evil for evil, and I can't get revenge? And to make it even worse, you want me to feed my enemies? In October 2003, in a commentary on this text, Michael Barham wrote, "What do you mean, never avenge yourselves? We're supposed to feed our enemies? Paul cannot possibly understand a contemporary real world or market economics, political upheaval, the global terrorism. His command to bless those who persecute may reflect a well-intentioned ideal, but appears woefully impractical in a post-9/11 world." Paul cannot be talking to us. He can't be talking to me. Or perhaps, Barham wrote, I am the one who was mistaken. Barham says that when he read these verses in the context of war, they become more personal and more concrete than they were any other time he had read them. I wonder if I'm the only one that understands what Barham is saying. I look around this sanctuary, and I suspect everyone here is remember where they were on September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers and the Pentagon were attacked and Flight 93 crashed in Shanksville. In the immediate aftermath, I had the honor of participating in a memorial service for a young man who was in one of the towers, and support a coworker mourning the loss of a friend who was one of the firefighters who had died. Never before then did turnout gear lying on a pair of boots outside a classroom door have such a powerful impact on me. And we all know what happened a few weeks later. The bombs and missiles started flying in the United States and invaded Afghanistan. Paul said, "Bless those who persecute you. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Never avenge yourself, and give your enemies food to drink." They're words similar to the words that Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Neither of them mentions anything about cruise missiles or the mother of all bombs. And for the last few years, due to advances in technology, we're able to fly robot planes from military bases here in the United States and bomb targets anywhere in the world. So here's my struggle, and maybe it's only mine. What do I do with that? How do I reconcile the words of Jesus and Paul with what is happening around the world? If, as Roy Harrisville suggests, Paul was writing to the entire community called the people of God, how do we people of God reconcile the words of Jesus with what is happening? Now, I don't know about anyone else's workplace, but at McCann School of Business, there was quite a bit of conversation around the faculty lunch table about whether or not the U.S. should invade Afghanistan. There were voices in favor and voices opposed, mine in the latter category. I can't say for certain, but there may have also been an email to an elected official or two expressing my opinion. Now, one of the reasons for that opposition is Jack, my younger brother, who at the time was a master sergeant in the United States Air Force. So I was against the initial invasion. So am I off the hook? Can I say that since I was opposed, I am not repaying evil for evil, or seeking vengeance, or dropping bombs instead of food? Is it that simple? On the other hand, from every paycheck while I worked for McCann and the borough, some of my wages were withheld and went to the U.S. Treasury. And now every quarter, the U.S. Treasury withdraws money from my bank account. I just set that up this weekend. That's a depressing thing to have to do. Some of that money is used to pay for those bombs and missiles. So does that put me back on the hook? Is there a line that separates me, the person of faith, from the actions taken by those who represent me? Where is that line? Now, a few folks have told me it's a different world out there, Mike. What the Bible says is so nice, but it's not realistic. We have to live in this world. Well, Paul knew that. Paul knew that we would have to live in this world. And he wants us to be engaged in the world, not withdraw from it. Archbishop Oscar Romero tells us our faith does not cut us off from the world, but immerses us in it. The church is not a fortress set apart from the city. The church follows Jesus, who lived, worked, struggled, and died in the midst of the city. Thursday night, Debbie and I were at Forks United Church of Christ. And the members of Forks UCC have T-shirts, and on the back of the T-shirts are footprints with the words above them are, "The church has left the building." Just putting into action exactly what Romero said there. Paul gave us some advice on living in the world as well. We heard it in last week's reading. He said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." For Barham, this is the key. If I don't have that radical transformation, if I don't change, have that change from the inside out that the message talks about, so I can discern the will of God, today's reading is a bunch of foolishness. If I am not transformed, if I remain conformed to the world, today's reading is impractical and idealistic. So what do I do with Romans 12 and the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain and a few other texts? Because they just don't make sense from the world's standpoint. My entire being, body and mind, is involved in this text. These verses are not some theory. They are how I, as a non-world conforming, transformed from the inside out, follower of Jesus, am supposed to live. If I live like that, and I will be the first to admit I fall short, but if I live like that, I'm behaving in a way that will enable good to overcome evil. Sure's final circle of relationship is all people. If there's anyone we missed in the first three circles, they are included in this fourth circle. So I talked about me and my struggle. But remember, these verses are directed to the entire community called the people of God. So I encourage you to reflect on these verses and how we as a faith community are transformed so our collective behavior will enable good to overcome evil. For Paul, all of these relationships are marked by humble, generous love, no matter the character or status of those to whom we relate. For Paul, there is no question, where's the line? For Paul, there is no line. Amen.